Page 159. Little Hobart Street led up onto one of those hollows so deep and narrow that people joked you had to pipe in the sunlight. The neighborhood did have lots of kids. Maureen had real friends for the first time, and we all tended to hang out at the National Guard Armory at the foot of the hill. The boys played tackle football in the training field. Most of the girls my age spent their afternoons sitting on the brick wall surrounding the armory, combing their hair and touching up their lip gloss and pretending to get all indignant, but secretly loving it if a crew cut reservist wolf whistled at them. One of the girls, Cindy Thompson, made a special effort to befriend me, but it turned out that what she really wanted was to recruit me for the junior Ku Klux Klan. Neither putting on makeup nor wearing a sheet had much appeal for me, so I played football with the boys, who would waive their guys only rule and let me join a team if they were a player short. The better off folk of Welch had not exactly flocked to our part of town. A few minors lived along the street, but most of the grown ups didn't work at all. Some of the moms had no husbands, and some of the dads had black lung. The rest were either too distracted by their troubles or just plain unmotivated. So pretty much everyone grudgingly accepted some form of public aid. Although we were the poorest family on Little Hobart Street, Mom and Dad never applied for welfare or food stamps, and they always refused charity. When teachers gave us bags of clothes from church drives, Mom made us take them back. We can take care of our own, Mom and Dad liked to say. We don't accept handouts from anyone. If things got tight, Mom kept reminding us that some of the other kids on Little Hobart Street had it tougher than we did. The 12 Grady kids had no dad. He'd either died in a mine cave-in or run off with a whore, depending on whom you listened to. And their mom spent her days in bed suffering from migraines. As a result, the Grady boys ran completely wild. It was hard to tell them apart because they all wore blue jeans and torn t-shirts and had their heads shaved bald to keep away lice. When the oldest boy found their dad's old pump-action shotgun under their mom's bed, he decided to get in some target practice on Brian and me, firing buckshot at us as we ran for our lives through the woods. And then there were the Halls. All 6 of the Hall children had been born mentally retarded, and although they were now middle-aged, they all still lived at home with their mom and dad. When I was friendly to the oldest, Kenny Hall, who was 42, he developed a powerful crush on me. The other kids in the neighborhood teased Kenny by telling him that if he gave them $1 or stripped down to his skivvies and showed them his wanker, they'd arrange for me to go on a date with him. On a Saturday night, if he'd been set up like that, he'd come stand on the street in front of our house, sobbing and hollering about me not keeping our date. And I'd have to go down and explain to him that the other kids had played a trick on him, and that although he did have many admirable qualities, I had a policy against dating older men. The family who had it the toughest on Little Hobart Street, I would have to say, was the Pastors. The mother, Ginny Sue Pastor, was the town whore. Ginny Sue Pastor was 33 years old and had 8 daughters and 1 son. Their names all ended with Y. Her husband, Clarence Pastor, had black lung and sat on the front porch of their huge sagging house all day long, but he never smiled or waved at passers-by, just sat there like he was frozen. Everyone in town said he'd been impotent for years, and so none of the Pastor kids was his. Ginny Sue Pastor pretty much kept to herself. At first, I wondered if she lay around in a lacy negligee all day, smoking cigarettes and waiting for gentlemen callers. Back in Battle Mountain, the women lounging on the front porch of the Green Lantern, I'd long since figured out what they really did, wore white lipstick and black mascara and partially unbuttoned blouses that showed the tops of their bras. But Ginny Sue Pastor didn't look like a whore. She was a blousy woman with dyed yellow hair, and from time to time we saw her out in the front yard, chopping wood or filling a scuttle from the coal pile. She usually wore the same kinds of aprons and canvas farm coats worn by the rest of the women on Little Hobart Street. She looked like any other mom. I also wondered how she did her whoring with all those kids to look after. One night, I saw a car pull up in front of the Pastor house and blink its headlights twice. After a minute, Ginny Sue came running out of the door and climbed into the front seat. Then the car drove off. Kathy was Ginny Sue Pastor's oldest daughter. The other kids treated her like a total pariah, like an outcast, crowing that her mother was a whore and calling her lice girl. Truth was, she did have a pretty advanced case of head lice. She kept trying to befriend me. One afternoon on the way home from school, when I told her we'd lived for a while in California, she lit up. She said her mama had always wanted to go there. She asked if maybe I'd come over to her place and tell her mama all about life in California. Of course, I went. I'd never gotten inside the Green Lantern, but now I'd get an up close look at a genuine prostitute. There were lots of things I wanted to know. Was whoring easy money? Was it ever any fun, or was it just gross? Did Kathy and her sisters and her father all know Ginny Sue Pastor was a whore? What did they think of it? I didn't plan on flat out asking these questions, but I did think that by getting inside the pastor's house and meeting Ginny Sue, I'd come away with some idea of the answers. Clarence Pastor, sitting on the porch, ignored Kathy and me as we walked by. Inside, there were all these tiny rooms connected together like boxcars. Because of the way the house was settling on the eroding hillside, the floors and ceilings and windows tilted at different angles. There were no paintings on the walls, but the pastors had taped up pictures of smartly dressed women torn from Sears Roebuck catalogs. Kathy's little sister scampered around noisily, half dressed. None of them looked alike. One was redheaded, one was blonde, one had black hair, and they were all different shades of brown. Sweet Man, the youngest, crawled along the living room floor, sucking on a fat dill pickle. Ginny Sue Pastor sat at the table in the kitchen. At her elbow was the carcass of a big, expensive roaster, like a chicken, the kind we could hardly ever afford. She had a tired, lined face, but her smile was cheerful and open. Pleased to meet you, she said to me, wiping her hands on her shirt tail. We ain't used to getting visitors. Ginny Sue offered us seats at the table. She had heavy breasts that swayed when she moved, and her blonde hair was dark at the roots. Y'all help me with this bird, and I'll fix you a couple of Ginny Sue special chicken rolls. She turned to me. You know how to pick a chicken clean? I sure do, I said. I hadn't had anything to eat all day. Well, show me then, Ginny Sue said. I went for a wing first, pulling apart the spindly double bones and getting all the meat trapped there. Then I set to work on the leg and thigh bones, snapping them at the joints and peeling off the tendons and digging out the marrow. Kathy and Ginny Sue were also working on the bird, but soon they stopped to watch me. From the tail, I plucked that nice piece of meat that everybody misses. I turned the carcass upside down and scraped off the jellied fat and meat flecks with my fingernails. I stuck my arm elbow deep into the bird to excavate any meat clinging to the rib cage. Girl, Ginny Sue said, in all my days, I'd never seen no one pick a chicken clean like you. I held up the spear-shaped cartilage in the breastbone, which most people don't eat, and bit down with a satisfying crunch. Ginny Sue scraped the meat into a bowl, mixed it with mayonnaise and Cheese Whiz, then crushed a handful of potato chips and added them. She spread the mixture onto 2 slices of Wonder Bread, then rolled each slice into a cylinder and passed them to us. Birds in a blanket, she said. They tasted great. Mama, Jeanette lived in California, Kathy said. That's so, Ginny Sue said. Live in California and be a stewardess. That was my dream, she sighed. Never got beyond Bluefield. I told her and Kathy about life in California. It quickly became clear they had no interest in desert mining towns, so I told them about San Francisco and then about Las Vegas, which wasn't exactly in California, but they didn't seem to care. I made the days we had spent there seem like years, and the showgirls I'd seen from a distance seem like close friends and neighbors. I described the glittering casinos and the glamorous high rollers, the palm trees and the swimming pools, the hotels with ice-cold air conditioning, and the restaurants where hostesses with long white gloves lit flaming desserts. It don't get no better than that, Ginny Sue said. No, ma'am, it sure don't, I told her. Sweet Man came in crying, and Ginny Sue picked him up and let him suck some mayonnaise off her finger. You did good on that bird, Ginny Sue told me. You strike me as the kind of girl who's one day going to be eating roast chicken and those on-fire desserts just as much as you want. She winked. It was only on the way home that I realized I hadn't gotten answers to any of my questions. While I was sitting there talking to Ginny Sue, I'd even forgotten she was a whore. One thing about whoring, it put a chicken on the table. We fought a lot in Welch, not just to fend off our enemies, but to fit in. Maybe it was because there was so little to do in Welch. Maybe it was because life there was hard and it made people hard. Maybe it was because of all the bloody battles over unionizing the mines. Maybe it was because mining was dangerous and cramped and dirty work, and it put all the miners in bad moods, and they came home and took it out on their wives, who took it out on their kids, who took it out on other kids. Whatever the reason, it seemed that just about everyone in Welch, men, women, boys, girls, liked to fight. There were brawls, bar stabbings, parking lot beatings, wife slappings, and toddler wailings. Sometimes it was simply a matter of someone throwing a stray punch, and it would all be over before you knew it had started. Other times it would be more like a 12-round prize fight, with spectators cheering on the bloody, sweating opponents. Then there were the grudges and feuds that went on for years. A couple of brothers beating up some guy because back in the 50s his father had beaten up their father. Or a woman shooting her best friend for sleeping with her husband, and the best friend's brother then stabbing the husband. You'd walk down McDowell Street, and half the people you passed seemed to be nursing an injury sustained in local combat. There were shiners, split lips, swollen cheekbones, bruised arms, scraped knuckles, and bitten earlobes. We had lived in some pretty scrappy places back in the desert, but Mom said Welch was the fightingest town she'd ever seen. Ryan and Lori and Maureen and I got into more fights than most kids. Denisha Hewitt and her friends were only the first in a whole line of little gangs who did battle with one or more of us. Other kids wanted to fight us because we had red hair, because Dad was a drunk, because we wore rags and didn't take as many baths as we should have, because we lived in a falling down house that was partly painted yellow and had a pit filled with garbage, because they'd go by our dark house at night and see that we couldn't even afford electricity. But we always fought back, usually as a team. Our most spectacular fight and our most audacious tactical victory, the Battle of Little Hobart Street, took place against Ernie Goad and his friends when I was 10 and Brian was 9. Ernie Goad was a pug-nosed, thick-necked kid who had little eyes set practically on the sides of his head, like a whale. He acted as if it was his sworn mission to drive the Walls family out of town. It started one day when I was playing with some other kids on the tank parked next to the armory. Ernie Goat appeared and began throwing rocks at me and yelling that the Wallses should all leave Welch because we were stinking it up so bad. I threw a couple of rocks back and told him to leave me alone. Make me, Ernie said. I don't make garbage, I shouted. I burn it. This was usually a foolproof comeback, making up in scorn what it lacked in originality. But on this occasion, it backfired. Y'all Wallses don't burn garbage, Ernie yelled back. Y'all throw it in a hole next to your house. You live in it. I tried to think of a comeback to his comeback, but my mind seized up because what Ernie had said was true. We did live in garbage. Ernie stuck his face in mine. Garbage. You live in garbage because you are garbage. I shoved him good and hard, then turned to the other kids, hoping for backup. But they were easing away and looking down, as if they were ashamed to have been caught playing with the girl who had a garbage pit next to her house. That Saturday, Brian and I were reading on the sofa bed when one of the window panes shattered and a rock landed on the floor. We ran to the door. Ernie and his 3 friends were pedaling their bikes up and down Little Hobart Street, whooping madly. Garbage, garbage, y'all a bunch of garbage. Brian went out on the porch. One of the kids hurled another rock that hit Brian in the head. He staggered back, then ran down the steps, but Ernie and his friends pedaled away, shrieking. Brian came back up the stairs, blood trickling down his cheek and onto his t-shirt, and a pump knot already swelling up above his eyebrow. Ernie's gang returned a few minutes later, throwing stones and shouting that they had actually seen the pigsty where the Walls kids lived, and that they were going to tell the whole school it was even worse than everyone said. This time, both Brian and I chased after them. Even though they outnumbered us, they were enjoying the game of taunting us too much to make a stand. They rode down to the first switchback and got away. They'll be back, Brian said. What are we going to do? I asked. Brian sat thinking, then told me he had a plan. He found some rope under the house and led me up to a clearing in the hillside above Little Hobart Street. A few weeks earlier, Brian and I had dragged an old mattress up there because we were thinking of camping out. Brian explained how we could make a catapult, like the medieval ones we'd read about, by piling rocks on the mattress and rigging it with ropes looped over tree branches. We quickly assembled the contraption and tested it once, jerking back on the ropes at the count of 3. It worked. A minor avalanche of rocks rained onto the street below. It was, we were convinced, enough to kill Ernie Goat and his gang, which was what we fully intended to do, kill them and commandeer their bikes, leaving their bodies in the street as a warning to others. We piled the rocks back on the mattress, re-rigged the catapult, and waited. After a couple of minutes, Ernie and his gang reappeared at the switchback. Each of them rode one-handed and carried an egg-sized rock in his throwing hand. They were proceeding single file, like a Pawnee war party, a few feet apart. We couldn't get them all at once, so we aimed for Ernie, who was at the head of the pack. When he came within range, Brian gave the word, and we jerked back on the ropes. The mattress shot forward, and our arsenal of rocks flew through the air. I heard them thud against Ernie's body and clatter on the road. He screamed and cursed as his bike skidded. The kid behind Ernie ran into him, and they both fell. The other two turned around and sped off. Brian and I started hurling whatever rocks were at hand. Since they were downhill, we had a good line of fire and scored several direct hits, the rocks dinging off their bikes, nicking the paint and denting the fenders. Then Brian yelled, "Charge!" and we came barreling down the hill. Ernie and his friend jumped back on their bikes and furiously pedaled off before we could reach them. As they disappeared around the bend, Brian and I did a victory dance in the rock-strewn street, giving our own war whoops. As the weather warmed, a sort of rough beauty overtook the steep hillsides around Little Hobart Street. Jack in the Pulpits and Bleeding Hearts sprouted wild. White Queen Anne's lace and purple phlox and big orange daylilies blossomed along the road. During the winter, you could see abandoned cars and refrigerators and the shells of deserted houses in the woods. But in the spring, the vines and weeds and moss grew over them, and in no time, they disappeared altogether. One benefit of summer was that each day we had more light to read by. Mom really piled up on books. She came home from the Welch Public Library every week or two with a pillowcase full of novels, biographies, and histories. She snuggled into bed with them, looking up from time to time, saying she was sorry. She knew she should be doing something more productive, but like Dad, she had her addictions, and one of them was reading. We all read, but I had never had the feeling of togetherness I had in Battle Mountain when we all sat around in the depot with our books. In Welch, people drifted off to different corners of the house. Once night came, we kids all lay on our rope and cardboard beds, reading by flashlight or a candle we'd set on our wooden boxes, each of us creating our own little pool of dim light. Lori was the most obsessive reader. Fantasy and science fiction dazzled her, especially The Lord of the Rings. When she wasn't reading, she was drawing orcs or hobbits. She tried to get everyone in the family to read the books. They transport you to a different world, she'd say. I didn't want to be transported to another world. My favorite books all involved people dealing with hardships. I loved The Grapes of Wrath, Lord of the Flies, and especially A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I thought Francie Nolan and I were practically identical, except that she had lived 50 years earlier in Brooklyn, and her mother always kept the house clean. Francie Nolan's father sure reminded me of Dad. If Francie saw the good in her father, even though most people considered him a shiftless drunk, maybe I wasn't a complete fool for believing in mine, or trying to believe in him. It was getting harder. One night that summer, when I was lying in bed and everyone else was asleep, I heard the front door open and the sound of someone muttering and stumbling around in the darkness. Dad had come home. I went into the living room where he was sitting at the drafting table. I could see by the moonlight coming through the window that his face and hair were matted with blood. I asked him what had happened. "I'd gotten a fight with the mountain," he said, "and the mountain won." I looked at Mom asleep on the sofa bed, her head buried under a pillow. She was a deep sleeper and hadn't stirred. When I lit the kerosene lamp, I saw that Dad also had a big gash in his right forearm and a cut on his head so deep that I could see the white of his skull. I got a toothpick and tweezers and picked the rocky grit out of the gash. Dad didn't wince when I poured rubbing alcohol on the wound. Because of all of his hair, I had no way to put a bandage, and I told Dad I should shave the area around the cut. "Hell, honey, that would ruin my image," he said. "A fellow in my position's got to look presentable." Dad studied the gash on his forearm. He tightened a tourniquet around his upper arm and told me to fetch Mom's sewing box. He fumbled around in it for silk thread, but unable to find any, decided that cotton would be fine. He threaded a needle with black thread, handed it to me, and pointed at the gash. "Sew it up," he said. "Dad, I can't do that." "Ah, go ahead, honey," he said. "I do it myself, except I can't do diddly with my left hand." He smiled. "Don't worry about me. I'm so thoroughly pickled, I won't feel a thing." Dad lit a cigarette and placed his arm on the table. "Go ahead," he said. I pressed the needle up against Dad's skin and shuddered. "Go ahead," he said again. I pushed the needle and felt a slight tug when it pierced the skin. I wanted to close my eyes, but I needed to see. I pushed a little harder and felt the resistance of Dad's flesh. It was like sewing meat. It was sewing meat. I can't, Dad. I'm sorry. I just can't do it, I said. We'll do it together, Dad said. Using his left hand, he guided my fingers as they pushed the needle all the way through his skin and out the other side. A few droplets of blood appeared. I pulled the needle out and then gave the thread a gentle jerk to tighten it. I tied the two ends of the thread together, like Dad told me to, and then, to put in a second stitch, did it again. The gash was pretty big and could have used a few more stitches, but I couldn't bring myself to stick that needle in Dad's arm one more time. We both looked at the two dark, slightly sloppy stitches. That's some fine handiwork, Dad said. I'm mighty proud of you, Mountain Goat. When I left the house the next morning, Dad was still asleep. When I came home in the evening, he was gone. Dad had taken to disappearing for days at a time. When I asked him where he'd been, his explanations were either so vague or so improbable that I stopped asking. Whenever he did come home, he usually brought a bag of groceries in each arm. We'd gobble the deviled ham sandwiches with thick slices of onion while he told us about the progress of his investigation into the UMW and his latest money-making schemes. People were always offering him jobs, he explained, but he wasn't interested in work for hire, in saluting and sucking up and brown-nosing and taking orders. You'll never make a fortune working for the boss man, he said. He was focused on striking it rich. There might not be gold in West Virginia, but there were plenty of other ways to make your pile. For instance, he was working on a technology to burn coal more efficiently, so that even the lowest grade coal could be mined and sold. There was a big market for that, he said, and it was going to make us rich beyond our dreams. I listened to Dad's plans and tried to encourage him, hoping that what he was saying was true, but also pretty certain it wasn't. Money would come in, and with it food, and on the rare occasion that Dad landed an odd job or Mom received a check from the oil company leasing the drilling rights on her land in Texas. Mom was always vague about how big the land was and where exactly it was, and she refused to consider selling it. All we knew was that every couple of months, this check would show up and we'd have plenty of food for days at a time. When the electricity was on, we ate a lot of beans. A big bag of pinto beans cost under $1 and would feed us for days. They tasted especially good if you added a spoonful of mayonnaise. We also ate a lot of rice mixed with jack mackerel, which Mom said was excellent brain food. Jack mackerel was not as good as tuna, but was better than cat food, which we ate from time to time when things got really tight. Sometimes Mom popped up a big batch of popcorn for dinner. It had lots of fiber, she pointed out, and she had us salt it heavily because the iodine would keep us from getting goiters. Don't want my kids looking like pelicans, she said. Once, when an extra big royalty check came in, Mom bought us a whole canned ham. We ate off it for days, cutting thick slices for sandwiches. Since we had no refrigerator, we left the ham on the kitchen shelf. After it had been there for about a week, I went to saw myself a slab at dinner time and found it crawling with little white worms. Mom was sitting on the sofa bed, eating the piece she'd cut. Mom, the ham's full of maggots, I said. Don't be so picky, she told me. Just slice off the maggoty parts. The inside's fine. Brian and I became expert foragers. We picked crab apples and wild blackberries and pawpaws during the summer and fall, and we swiped ears of corn from Old Man Wilson's farm. The corn was tough. Old Man Wilson grew it as feed for his cattle, but if you chewed it enough, you could get it down. Once we caught a wounded blackbird by throwing a blanket over it and figured we could make a blackbird pie, like in the nursery rhyme, but we couldn't bring ourselves to kill the bird, and anyway, it looked too scrawny to eat. We'd heard of a dish called poke salad, and since a big patch of pokeweed grew behind our house, Brian and I thought we'd give it a try. If it was any good, we'd have a whole new supply of food. We first tried eating the pokeweed raw, but it was awfully bitter, so we boiled it, singing Poke Salad Annie in anticipation. But it still tasted sour and stringy, and our tongues itched for days afterward. One day, hunting for food, we climbed through the window of an abandoned house. The rooms were tiny and it had dirt floors, but in the kitchen we found shelves lined with rows of canned food. Bonanza, Brian cried out. Feast time, I said. The cans were coated with dust and starting to rust, but we figured the food was still safe to eat, since the whole point of canning was to preserve. I passed a can of tomatoes to Brian, who took out his pocket knife. When he punctured the tin, the contents exploded in his face, covering us with a fizzy brown juice. We tried a few more, but they exploded too, and we walked home without having eaten anything, our shirts and faces stained with rotten tomatoes. When I started 6th grade, the other kids made fun of Brian and me because we were so skinny. They called me Spider Legs, Skeleton Girl, Pipe Cleaner, 2x4, Bony Butt, Stick Woman, Bean Pole, and Giraffe. And they said I could stay dry in the rain by standing under a telephone wire. At lunchtime, when other kids unwrapped their sandwiches or bought their hot meals, Brian and I would get out books and read. Brian told everyone he had to keep his weight down because he wanted to join the wrestling team when he got to high school. I told people that I had forgotten to bring my lunch. No one believed me, so I started hiding in the bathroom during lunch hour. I'd stay in one of the stalls with the door locked and my feet propped up so that no one would recognize my shoes. When other girls came in and threw away their lunch bags in the garbage pails, I'd go retrieve them. I couldn't get over the way kids tossed out all this perfectly good food: apples, hard boiled eggs, packages of peanut butter crackers, sliced pickles, half pint cartons of milk, cheese sandwiches with just one bite taken out because the kid didn't like the pimentos and the cheese. I'd return to the stall and polish off my tasty finds. There was, at times, more food in the wastebasket than I could eat. The first time I found extra food, a bologna and cheese sandwich, I stuffed it into my purse to take home for Brian. Back in the classroom, I started worrying about how I'd explain to Brian where it came from. I was pretty sure he was rooting through the trash too, but we never talked about it. As I sat there trying to come up with ways to justify it to Brian, I began smelling the bologna. It seemed to fill the whole room. I became terrified that the other kids could smell it too, and that they'd turn and see my overstuffed purse. And since they all knew I never ate lunch, they'd figure out that I had pinched it from the trash. As soon as class was over, I ran to the bathroom and shoved the sandwich back in the garbage can. Maureen always had plenty to eat, since she had made friends throughout the neighborhood and would show up at their houses around dinner time. I had no idea what Mom and Lori were doing to fend for themselves. Mom, weirdly, was getting heavier. One evening when Dad was away and we had nothing to eat and we were all sitting around the living room trying not to think of food, Mom kept disappearing under the blanket on the sofa bed. At one point, Brian looked over. "Are you chewing something?" he asked. "My teeth hurt," Mom said. But she was getting all shifty-eyed, glancing around the room and avoiding our stares. "It's my bad gums. I'm working my jaw to increase the circulation." Brian yanked the covers back. Lying on the mattress next to Mom was one of those huge, family-sized Hershey chocolate bars, the shiny silver wrapper pulled back and torn away. She'd already eaten half of it. Mom started crying. "I can't help it," she sobbed. "I'm a sugar addict, just like your father is an alcoholic." She told us we should forgive her the same way we always forgave Dad for his drinking. None of us said a thing. Brian snatched up the chocolate bar and divided it into 4 pieces. While Mom watched, we wolfed them down.